Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Sunflower State, Kansas. Kansas contains the geographic center of the 48 contiguous states in the town of Lebanon, Kansas in the northern part of the state, and that exact point is delineated with a marker within the town. The state is also home to many influential names in Hollywood, including actor-director Dennis Hopper, silent comedian legend Buster Keaton, and actress Hattie McDaniel, who was the first African-American woman to win an Academy Award, and that was for Gone with the Wind in 1940. Cawker City, Kansas is also home to the largest ball of twine in the world, clocking in at 38 feet in circumference and nearly 17,000 pounds. Kansas has 4 congressional House districts, and the current balance of power is 3 Republicans to 1 Democrat. That lone Democratic district is Kansas's 3rd, which is represented by Sharice Davids, who won her first term in 2018, making her one of the 2 first Native American women to win a seat in Congress, the other being Deborah Haaland from New Mexico's 1st District. She defeated 4-term Republican Congressman Kevin Yoder back in 2018 and is running again for a 2nd term this year in her urban and suburban district, with a partisan lean of +4 into the Republican column when compared to the national average, according to the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voting Index. Another district that is particularly interesting to me this year is Kansas's 2nd district, which has a lean of +10 into the Republican column, making it less competitive than Kansas's 3rd. But why this district is interesting is because its freshman representative, Steve Watkins, was just primaried last week after recent allegations of voter fraud came up against him. He lost his primary pretty significantly against another Republican who is vying for the seat, and more likely than not, that Republican will win the district, but it is interesting to think that possibly Steve Watkins, a Republican, may have left a bitter taste in voters' mouth heading into November this year. To see how Kansans have really been voting for their representatives, let's take a look at a double line graph right now. And here we're looking at vote totals for all districts, all 4 districts within the state of Kansas going back over the last decade, and we see Republicans with a clear advantage every year, with that clear advantage dwindling significantly going from 2016 to 2018, when Democrats actually showed up in much bigger numbers during a midterm year than they did in the prior presidential year, that being 2016. 2018 was, of course, the year that Sharice Davids won her first term in Kansas's 3rd, and she was able to do that pretty handily. She won by a significant margin of the vote in that district, largely due in part to this massive increase in turnout, which I'm sure was mostly in the eastern corner of the state, where there are many urban and suburban voters in the western half of Kansas City. That upward lurch going from 2016 to 2018 in Democrats' favor is the reason that their slope value is noticeably better than Republicans, but we'll get into that in a later section. We're just going to use this line graph now to extrapolate whether or not we think Kansas's 2nd or 3rd will remain in their respective columns or flip this year. So let's toss that graph aside. I think definitely Kansas's 2nd is going to remain in Republican hands this year. The district does have a lean of +10 into the Republican column, which is not an insignificant partisan lean at all. I don't think one bad egg in Steve Watkins is going to be enough to turn off enough voters to cause a Democratic challenger to win the seat. I also think that Kansas's 3rd is going to remain in Democratic hands, and actually, I do believe Sharice Davids is going to increase her margin of victory. It was about 10% 2 years ago. I wouldn't be surprised to see her winning that seat by about 12 to 15% margin of the vote this year. Of course, the very urban, suburban nature of her district is part of that category that lashed out heavily against Republicans 2 years ago, and I have no reason to believe that in a presidential year, that being 2020, that enthusiasm would diminish in any sort of significant way. So at the end of the day, we have no flips in Kansas's House districts. Let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. Up next, we have a Senate election in Kansas. Incumbent Republican Senator Pat Roberts is retiring at the conclusion of his term this year, and therefore we are seeing a U.S. House Representative for Kansas's 1st District, Roger Marshall, running on the Republican ticket, and physician and state Senator Barbara Bollier running on the Democratic ticket. Kansas's state primaries actually just occurred last week, and a lot of people had their eye particularly on that Republican primary. Marshall was able to win pretty handily against another Republican challenger named Kris Kobach, a former Secretary of State for the state of Kansas, and the Republican who notoriously lost the gubernatorial race 2 years ago in the state. Kobach was and is a particularly controversial figure in the state of Kansas and nationwide, due in large part to his allegations of voter fraud during the 2016 presidential election, where he claimed repeatedly without evidence that enough fraudulent votes were cast, particularly in the state of New Hampshire, to tilt the state into Hillary Clinton's column over Donald Trump's. To this day, he has not provided any evidence for that claim, and voters certainly did not forget his historic loss in the state 2 years ago against current Democratic Governor Laura Kelly. And enough Republicans were horrified at the prospect of losing a Senate seat because of the guy this year, so they opted to send Roger Marshall to the final race. Kobach was seen as enough of a liability by both parties that actually Democrat-run groups donated to his campaign heading into the primary, hoping that they would have Barbara Bollier being able to face this very controversial candidate, making Kansas, in their eyes, more competitive than it possibly could be with Roger Marshall in the race. But that obviously didn't pan out. Is there a pattern to how Kansans vote for their senators relative to their House candidates? Let's pull up some voter ratios right now to figure that out. And the answer to that question is not so much. Going back over the past 3 election cycles for senatorial candidates in the state of Kansas, we see parties kind of flipping back and forth every other cycle in their enthusiasm for either the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate relative to their respective House candidates of their party. Pat Roberts 6 years ago had accumulated less votes than the total of Republican House candidates running in the state that year, whereas his Democratic challenger received about 18% more votes than the total of all Democratic House candidates running in 2014. What's also interesting to note about Democrats in particular is how over the last decade their turnout ratios have increased every time. So at least they're all trending in the same direction. On the left, the Republicans are a little less predictable. I mean, they had good turnout for senatorial candidates in 2010, then down 2014, back up in 2016. So it's a little harder to predict how they might turn out for Roger Marshall this year. But we have to work with what we have, so let's toss those numbers aside right now. Because there's no incumbent in this race with Pat Roberts retiring, there's no approval rating to consider in our calculations to see how this is going to go down. So we're just going to give raw House turnout numbers and those voter turnout ratios to Pollbot to calculate how this is going to go down in November. Pollbot, would you calculate for us? And there you have it. You have a Republican victory in the state of Kansas, but by a very narrow 2.43% margin of victory. This outcome is very close, and it does align with actually a few polls that have been conducted over the past few months, matching up Barbara Bollier against Roger Marshall. Of course, they also were conducting Barbara Bollier versus Kris Kobach, and those were tighter results in those polls. So this 2.43 margin of victory for Marshall would be in alignment with those polls. Of course, there were other polls as well that had him winning more handily. I think the reason this is as tight as it is because of that huge lurch in turnout from 2016 to 2018 on Democrats' end for House candidates, which in my calculation is enough to make this seat more competitive than it has been in decades. It wouldn't shock me to see Roger Marshall winning the seat by a slightly larger margin of victory than this. Kansas is a state that has not elected a Democrat to the United States Senate since 1932, and Marshall is seen as a much less polarizing candidate than Kobach would have been. But ultimately, I do think this is going to be closer than people expect, ultimately with a Republican victory. So let's make that official and put it on our senatorial map. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Kansas is a state that last voted for a Democratic candidate in 1964, as did most of the states in the country when they sent LBJ to the White House over challenger Barry Goldwater. But more recently, we saw Kansas break for Donald Trump in 2016 over Hillary Clinton by over 20% margin of the vote. Going off of those facts alone, it's pretty safe to say that Kansas has been a Republican stronghold at the presidential level in recent years. But is that trend likely to continue into this November? Let's pull up first some voter ratios to see how Kansans have been voting for presidents. And here, actually a glimmer of hope for Democrats in the state. For both of the last previous presidential election cycles over the last decade, we saw Democrats with a pretty significant advantage and enthusiasm for presidential candidates versus House candidates in the state. Actually, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016 enjoyed better voter ratios than either Barack Obama or Mitt Romney did 4 years prior to that, with a more significant jump enjoyed by Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump enjoyed. But remember, these values are relative to House turnout numbers, so at the end of the day, Hillary Clinton having an advantage of nearly 30 points in those voter ratios was not enough to carry her the state. She still lost by 20% of the vote because there were so many more Republicans turning out to vote for House candidates that year. But keeping these voter ratios in the backs of our minds when considering that lurch in Democrats' favor from 2016 to 2018 at the House level, we have to think, okay, well, could this possibly make Kansas competitive at the presidential level? Well, let's toss those numbers aside. And lastly, we do have to consider the approval rating of the incumbent in this race, in this case, President Trump. And he is, as of this video, enjoying a +4 approval rating in the state, specifically 50% of Kansans approve versus 46% that do not, which is not great. I mean, it's above water, but just barely. A state like Kansas that has not elected a Democratic presidential candidate in 56 years, you would expect a Republican incumbent to have a higher approval rating than this, but that's what the figures are. And now we have raw House turnout numbers, we have those voter ratios, and we have Trump's approval rating. We can give all that to Pollbot to calculate how this is going to go down for Trump and Biden in Kansas. Pollbot. Woo, wow, and this is very close. Very surprising. I think this is actually too close, and honestly, I don't expect Biden to have this good a performance in the state of Kansas. Even though the Republican is still winning, a margin of victory of 2.79% is, that's practically zero. I understand that Trump has a pretty lukewarm approval rating in the state, and Democrats turned out in big numbers 2 years ago, but I find it very questionable that this state could possibly shift 18 points into the Democrats' favor just 4 years after they sent Donald Trump to the White House by a significant margin. Another factor that I have not really considered yet up to this point that may be playing into this outcome for the state of Kansas specifically is primary turnout at the presidential level. Kansas is a state that conducts open primaries, meaning that you don't have to be affiliated with either party to vote in a party's primary, so you can be a registered Democrat and vote in the Republican primary and vice versa. However, in spite of that, so 2016, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were the main two contenders running for the presidency 4 years ago, and they received a total of 40,000 votes in the presidential primary in Kansas. Fast forward 4 years, and you see Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders accumulating 140,000 votes. That's an increase of about 250% going from 2016 to 2020. Of course, there could be a bunch of Republicans voting in that Democratic presidential primary this year because they are open, but an increase of 100,000 votes in the state of Kansas should not be ignored heading into this November. I do definitely think Trump will carry the state of Kansas this year. I don't think it will be this close, but we'll see. Let's make it official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So all the election results are in for the state of Kansas, and although we have not seen any flips, we have seen major strides for Democrats this year. Let's talk briefly about the future of the Sunflower State by pulling up an old line graph and two new ones. First, we're going to look at the raw House turnout graph that we were looking at earlier in the video, specifically look at these slope values that you see accompanying both of those dotted lines. So that value preceding X for Republicans is negative 0.3, which is pretty insignificant. I mean, it's practically zero. What that value is telling us basically is that when you look at the last decade as a whole, every 2 years or every election cycle, Republican House candidates have received 300 fewer votes than they did in the previous election cycle. Democrats, on the other hand, with that huge jump from 2016 to 2018 to cap off their decade, has them enjoying a slope value of 27, meaning that on average every 2 years, Democratic House candidates have received 20,000 more votes than they did in the previous election cycle, meaning that Democrats have been gaining an average of about 6,500 votes on Republicans every 2 years over the last decade. This is largely the reason why Sharice Davids was able to win so handily in Kansas' 3rd 2 years ago, and why I've projected her to win by an even greater margin this year. It's also largely playing into the fact that the Senate seat and the presidential seat are projected to be somewhat competitive in Kansas. That's also backed up by these other two line graphs, which are projecting the average rate of increase or decrease in those voter ratios I was using in my calculations. And at the end of the day, or at the end of the decade rather, we do see Democrats coming out on top in both categories, as not only their raw House turnout numbers increase, but their enthusiasm for the senatorial candidate and the presidential candidate increases on top of that, multiplying their chances to make Republicans in Kansas sweat as we head into the future. Of course, I projected that neither the Democratic candidate in the Senate or the presidential race will win this year, but they are making huge gains on how they have been performing in past years, very recent past years. So let's toss all those graphs aside. I'll give you my final consensus on Kansas. It has obviously very dramatically made a huge lurch to the left that may have been driven from 2016 to 2018 by the presence of Donald Trump in the White House. Also, a contributing factor could have been Kris Kobach's potential governorship heading into 2018, which many Kansans were very much opposed to. Obviously, they elected Laura Kelly. It seems to me that there were enough controversial Republicans at the top of the ticket in Kansas 2 years ago and 4 years ago to turn out Democrats in a pretty dramatic way, netting them one gain in the House seat. Whether or not this is an ongoing trend in Kansas, I'm honestly not sure yet. I mean, 2018 could have been a fluke because of a particularly bad gubernatorial candidate, or it could be evidence of a larger trend in where Democrats are becoming emboldened for the first time in a long time in a state that has long been a Republican stronghold. This November election will be very telling to get to the bottom of that question. But obviously, Kansas has been historically very Republican, and I do see it becoming more Democrat. Just how more Democrat remains to be seen, and we'll find out very soon. That just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting. See you next time.